From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. All right, I am joined with Charley Cummings. Charley co-founded a banking options for regenerative farmers called Walden Mutual, and I'm excited to talk to him. We're going to get into some conversations around loans, different ideas, and different strategies they have for farmers managing their money, and then also acquiring new land and some of the options that they have. It's a relatively new bank. They're based in the Northeast, but they span across the country right now, and we're excited to have you join us, Charley. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Taylor. Excited to chat.
Yeah, so I think let's just get in. Give me a brief background why you guys are, laser focused on more of the regenerative side of agriculture, and what brought you to the point of helping found Walden Mutual.
Yeah, so by way of background, I'm not really a banker by trade. I had started a company back in 2013 called Walden Local, which is a brand of pasture-based meat here in the Northeast. And we work with 100 different partner farmers across the region to produce grass-fed beef, pasture-raised pork, chicken, lamb, etc. And as that business grew, we vertically integrated backwards to own and operate a slaughter and processing plant and a pick-pack cold storage facility. So, I got to know the nuances of that supply chain quite well. And it, at some point, became clear that we were financing a lot of the growth of that supply chain. And the more I poked around, the more it was clear there was a gap in the existing financing infrastructure. And we also had a hard time finding the right banking relationship ourselves, a bank that understood the nuances of an e-commerce subscription brand that also owned livestock that we were placing on area farms under contract. So, the reality is in most other regions of the country, you have commercial banks that have practice areas or specializations in food and ag. And here in the Northeast, we really lack that. And you've, of course, got farm credit, but there are really no remaining commercial banks that do that kind of lending. And even more so nationally, there wasn't a bank that was oriented around sustainability and regenerative practices specifically. And so that was sort of the basis of one side of the bank's balance sheet. I think the basis of the other side, the deposit side, was just recognizing that as an individual, this is this sort of out of sight, out of mind thing. But where you place your deposit dollars is actually one of the most impactful personal consumption decisions you make as an individual. And when you think about issues around food, waste, energy, when we make those things, our choices around those things, someone else's problem somewhere else, it's a coal plant in somebody else's backyard, or it's a farm, with chemical runoff into a stream in someone else's backyard, or it's a landfill that is 2,000 miles away from me. That's what creates negative externalities, particularly environmental, but also economic and other negative consequences that are totally out of sight, out of mind for me as a consumer. It turns out, though, the reason I say banking is one of the most impactful choices you make is banking is ultimately what is enabling those things. And so when you have an opportunity instead to put your deposit dollars in a place that is investing them in a very deliberate way, that can be very impactful from an environmental perspective generally, and maybe a carbon perspective in particular, because your alternative is putting those dollars in a big bank where there's been studies that specifically look at what those dollars are being used for, and the carbon impact of $100,000 in a bank account at one of the top three banks in the US is the same as your carbon footprint for an entire year. So recognizing that not everybody has $100,000 to put in the bank, I'm just using that um, as a comparative point. Uh, it seems like this harmless thing, putting your money in the bank, but it's actually like those dollars are going out and being used somewhere. And who are the single largest funders of fossil fuel development around the world? It's the top three deposit taking banks in this country. So when you have an alternative to say those dollars are going to fund more sustainable farms, uh, more sustainable manufacturing facilities, brands that are creating the demand for these products, um, that's really what we're oriented around, is lending towards farms and businesses that have a view towards a more sustainable future.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess I've never really considered, just the money that's sitting in your bank account, what it's doing behind the scenes. Are you offering more of a higher interest rate on that money?
Yeah, good point. So it's can't be a purely altruistic motivation, right? You have to be able to um, offer something competitive from a rate perspective. So I think our deposit rates stack up well relative to the top digital banks in the country. Um, and encourage you to check them out on our website. It's waldenmutual.com. Um, but I would say you shouldn't have to make a sacrifice to feel like your dollars are doing something good in the world from a
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah. Getting into a little bit about your Walden local meat business. What are some of the things that you discovered that are the major challenges in that business model? Like, if you guys started it, say 2018 or 2019, we're obviously looking at a wildly. When did you start it?
2013,
Okay, so
even
I
more
mean,
than
I guess you went through the roller coaster of pricing in 14, 15 there.
yep.
But you come out of 18, 19, 20 where cattle prices are obviously really low. How have you guys adjusted to, like for us, stockers cost us 3 times as much as they did in 21.
Yeah, a market's crazy now. So just to be clear, I'm not involved in the day to day of that business. Sold a chunk of the business back in 21, 22, and started putting together plans for the bank. And so one thing obviously naturally led to the next, but um, I think a lot of lessons learned. I think that pricing challenges on the cattle side, in our case, were mitigated somewhat by um, we had we offered beef, chicken, lamb, fish, and then a variety of other sort of accompanying products. And so we didn't have too much exposure to any one of those, although beef by and large is, I think, remains the sort of largest portion of that mix. Um, but we got through those ups and downs a bunch of different ways. One part of the cycle, we had a decent portion of our own cattle on contract placed on area farms, and that is a way of us, alleviating the capital need on the farm side. There's a lot of places in New England where you can find really cheap temporary access to land, sometimes free, where people want to make sure their field is utilized and their alternative is haying it, and so they'll allow you to put cattle on it. And so that was a model that worked really well on some of those up cycles. I think we also are a little bit insulated from the larger market because these are all grass finished animals. And so your replacement costs are obviously subject to what's going on in commodity markets, but your finishing costs don't necessarily change. That's more a reflection of what's the growing season been like in the region. So I could talk about that for another hour around how we navigated the changes in the price environment there. But I guess one more thing to say is it's by and large a share program. So
Yeah.
we were selling, like, the operating equation of the company is a whole animal comes in one door and has to go out another door. And when you're selling by the piece, that's an insanely complicated price optimization challenge. In our case, it was made a little bit easier by virtue of, we sell shares in which folks were, and now today increasingly totally customizing that offering, but it's in a constrained way that allowed us to still move the whole animal at roughly the same pace for every part and piece, if that makes sense.
So one thing that people go back and forth about is, so I would call this the marketing company, Walden Local Meat, actually owns the cattle as well, because some people will separate those where the farm owns the cattle and then they'll separate the marketing company. The marketing company buys the finished product from the farmer, even if it's you, to keep those things separated from a liability standpoint.
Walden's always done a little bit of both,
Yeah.
and it's it's mostly been animals owned on the farm side. It was only when it made sense from a market perspective or from a capital perspective to lean sort of backwards into the life cycle.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what I'm saying though? Like, is there a liability issue with the marketing company selling the meat that also owns the land and the cattle? Someone eats something and gets sick from it, can they sue you?
When you say you, do you mean the farmer?
Yeah, like I'm picturing Walden Local Meat owning the asset of the land and the asset of the cattle, and then also selling the product.
Never own land.
Yeah, okay.
So we were just placing cows under contract on area farms. But I would say,
Gotcha.
in almost any circumstance, no matter how you structure that, like, the lion's share of the liability is going to rest with the brand.
Yeah. Yeah, the brand that's selling it.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean that's why I think and we've looked at it, is I want the marketing company to be separate from the entity that owns the largest asset in the land.
I think that makes sense. I mean, that's also part of the equation of why we moved backwards into owning and operate a slaughter facility is we felt like as soon as we became a decent portion of that plant's volume, we sort of already owned the plant from a liability standpoint, but not actually from an asset standpoint. In other words, we were exposed to all of the risk, but we had none of the control. Um,
Yeah.
and so at some point it made sense to integrate that.
Did you buy the plant that you were processing through, or did you start a different one?
We started with a minority investment and then moved into a majority position. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think one of the biggest issues that we have right now is you can look at like some of the pricing models, and how can farming be profitable enough for someone to make a living on, and then also you have to acquire the asset in most situations to do the actual farming practice. So access to capital can be difficult, obviously. Especially when you have farms that don't necessarily report a ton of profit. So how do you guys differ from other banks when it comes, someone walks up to you and says, hey, I want to buy this 120 acre piece, here's my business plan. I guess walk me through what is different about someone getting a loan from Walden Mutual than another bank.
I think a couple things. One is, worth observing, particularly here in the Northeast, but I think this is true in other parts of the country as well. Increasingly, the types of farms that are working, and more than working, like thriving and growing, are much more multidimensional than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And so if you are, uh, you said 120 acres, if you're operating a farm of that scale, the way to make it work is economies of scope. You've probably heard that concept before, but basically, how do you come up with a diversified operation that is yielding more from the same plot of ground? And I don't mean more of the same, I mean more of different sort of types of enterprises. So, we've lent to a lot of operations that have transitioned from, I'll give you this one example of a generational transfer of what was once a wholesale berry operation that produced two or three varieties of um, berries, blueberries, and currants, to now it's passed on to the next generation. And the son and his now wife have a really different vision for what that property is going to be and how to make it work. And instead of having a single wholesale buyer of essentially all of the crop, they have a pretty interesting pick your own operation. They have an on-site brewery that they're using some of the currents in different microbrews. They have a yurt on site. They have a really solid weddings and events business. And it's a much more diversified and resilient business than it was a few years ago. And I think a lot of traditional lenders looked at that and said, well, we don't, there used to be a counterparty on the other side of this business that we were effectively underwriting, and now there's not. And this doesn't look like a farm anymore. And we looked at it and said, well, this is actually a much more resilient and diversified business than it was 5 years ago. And um, might require different nuances in the way that their debt stack is structured. So anyhow, that means that a lot of the work we do and what feels different is more bespoke to specific types of operations. So another example is the one you and I were just talking about before, where we made a loan for. It was actually a refinancing of a additional piece of ground for an organic grass-fed dairy operation. And one of the things about grass-fed production, as you probably know, is because you have inconsistent inputs, that is the production of a pasture and the nutritional quality of that pasture, uh, you will have inconsistent outputs, the yield of the milk and the composition of the milk. And that means you have inconsistent revenues, as opposed to a feedlot operation where you're very precisely controlling the inputs and therefore you get more predictable outputs. But nobody had put a loan in place that reflected that variance. So we put together a mortgage for the underlying farmland that had an interest only period in the fairly predictable times of the year where the nutritional quality of the forage is reduced, and therefore the milk yield and butterfat content and otherwise is reduced. And so the benefit of that is they effectively have a term loan that allows them to make a smaller payment in those months without getting pushed into a technical default, which is not good for us either. We don't want to call someone into a technical default when there actually really isn't a deficiency in the underlying business. It's just a seasonal variation. So anyhow, that's one example of a fairly bespoke product that we designed around an operation. I think another thing that we've been different on is recognizing that the amortization term, particularly on farmland, is as important to the monthly payment structure as the interest rate. And it's difficult for a bank to go out 20, 30 plus years on a piece of property because we're trying to match our assets and liabilities. And so we went out and raised a 100-year CD to support this idea that we want to be able to support longer term amortizations on farmland mortgages, not just because of the current interest rate environment, but because there are so many operations where the difference that creates in a month, the difference between a 20-year and a 40-year amortizing loan is very significant from a monthly payment standpoint. And so that's been an effective way for us to bridge the gap for an operation that just isn't consistently enough producing the cash flow to pay a shorter term amortizing loan. So I think ultimately, like, we are trying to provide folks with the right types and structure of financing at the right time, instead of sort of pushing them through a formulaic model, if you will.
Hey everyone, hope your summer is going well. Just wanted to update you on some events that we have for the end of summer here in the fall. August 6th, we'll be in Oklahoma for an organic transition field day at Acadian Family Farm. That's a free event. August 19th through the 20th, we'll be in Spring Green at Gary Zimmer's farm, and that'll be a event hosted with Gary and Savannah Institute, talking about installing perennial crops into cropping systems and grazing systems. And Gary Zimmer will be a speaker there, Mark Shepard, and then some folks from Savannah Institute. September 10th, we'll be in North Dakota, which is again another free organic success field day at Minokan Farm with Jay Fear. And then September 12th through the 14th in Viroqua, Wisconsin, we're going to have a water earthwork live harvest demonstration and intensive workshop with Mark Shepard and his RAD team. So if you ever wanted to see how to put swales, berms, and water systems in and learn from Mark for 3 days, that'll be a very good, highly intensive event. And it'll be probably a little bit smaller group. So these are hands-on gatherings designed for you guys who want to build healthier soils, stronger businesses, and lasting resilience. And I also want to mention before I wrap it up here, we have our 50th annual EcoAg Conference this December 1st through the 4th in Madison, Wisconsin. And we are bringing a giant lineup again with people like Joel Salatin, Gabe Brown, Rick Clark, John Kemp, Will Harris, Neil Kinsey, and many more premier regenerative agriculture speakers. And I think it's going to be one of the best events ever put on in the regenerative agriculture space. So go ahead and check out more, register for our events. You can head to acresusa.com/events, and you'll see everything there. Yeah. Well, that makes tons of sense. I think 40-year amortizations are really important when it comes to farmland. When as a bank, and you sit there and you look at assets that are available to you, is land considered one of the safest things to lend on, just because it's, the value is, and how do you separate like the operation on the land and then the asset of the land itself? Do you, because obviously I look at like the asset of the land, that should be a no-brainer. That's an easy thing for a bank to lend on. It's not, in theory, going to go somewhere.
It is.
But
it's definitely the easiest thing to get your arms around from a collateral perspective. However, you still have to have the confidence in the operation that it can produce the cash flow to pay the debt. For the bank, us owning a piece of land is not a good outcome. And so it is probably the most secure and easiest piece of collateral. It's also, you were sort of alluding to this, but it's obviously intended over longer periods of time to be appreciating as opposed to depreciating, like equipment and vehicles and everything else. So I guess although it is a stronger, more secure piece of collateral, it's just different. I mean, we also finance working capital lines of credit and equipment lines and things to support other needs, and they might have a different set of assets behind them and are structured accordingly. But it's ultimately, I think what serves us well, to your earlier question too, in approaching a particular agricultural enterprise, is just trying to look at the situation holistically. So consider what other sources of income are available. Often you'll have a couple that is running an operation and one or both people have other outside sources of income, and it's important to consider those as from sort of a global perspective as part of the total package. Conversely, it's also important to factor in what is required from a living expense perspective, because if you're not covering you and your family's sort of basic needs, then that's going to obviously result in some trouble from a business and or ultimately lending perspective. So that sort of holistic analysis is generally not cookie cutter. And I think there's a big, particularly with the AI push, there's a big movement from an industry perspective to continue automating these types of loans. And for the types of operations like the one I just described, um, that just makes it harder to get a loan because they don't always check the same boxes. They can't always be fit into those, formulas without a human being considering, what is the underlying story here.
Do you see a lot of banks moving to that where it's pretty much you're going to fill out this long questionnaire, it's going to get shot into an AI model and spit out a result, and then there's going to be the loan officer's job is going to be cut in half?
I don't see an alternative. So
Yeah.
we've been in now for approximately 40 years this massive consolidation of banks in general. So we have half the number of banks in this country in 2020 relative to the year 2000 as a result of consolidation. And so when the institutions are larger and larger, they don't like making bespoke $500,000, $2 million loans. Those have to be formulaic, or it just doesn't work in an organization of that scale. And so we've seen the same thing in the farm credit world, is just continued consolidation. And so I don't know what choice you have but to increasingly automate those smaller loans, because otherwise they don't move the needle from a balance sheet perspective, and so it's hard to justify investing in the time it takes to structure them and underwrite them, unless they check those formulaic boxes.
Yeah. I mean, it should speed up the process in some ways. Do you guys use it at all?
AI?
Yeah.
Not really. I think there are bits and parts of the organization that are, contemplating how some of our third-party vendors might pull in AI for very specific tasks, but we really haven't touched it from, a credit or underwriting perspective, and I wouldn't
Yeah.
anticipate that for quite some time.
When you, of the loans that you guys are processing, what is the percentage of a family or a person or a group coming to you where the outside source of income is probably like the thing that gets the loan done? Like, how many of these folks actually have balance sheets and P&Ls from their farming business that would support them scaling and using a mortgage to do so?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a specific number in mind, but I would say I would guess not the majority, but I would guess somewhere around a third have a source of outside income that's not the sole reason the loan gets done, but is an important factor to originating it in the first place, with the intention of over this is not always the case, but in many cases the intention is to reduce that outside activity over some number of years as the farming business stabilizes and grows. So I would say in the situations where you have a young and beginning farmer, or just a newer operation with less history, that's where it is. It is usually a important part of the picture.
Yeah. And then of the 2/3 that don't have the outside income, what percentage do you think of them are coming from old money, inheritance, or something that alternative money?
Um, Not a lot. I don't know. There's definitely a portion in there that are projects that look like that, where this is somebody's second or third career, and they've got money to put into it and are fine with it losing money for several years, and the financial strength of that individual is a component of the loan. Um, but I think there are just as many, operating farms that are making it work with what they can produce on the property they're operating on. But again, those by and large are the types of diversified operations um, that have multiple streams of income, that they don't look like a monoculture single crop wholesale type of operation at the scale we're
Yeah.
talking about. And because
So,
we still have a small balance sheet, like we really are not lending more than $3 or $4 million to any single entity. And so if you've got a farm that is uh, grossing 10-20 million dollars, you're starting to go outside of our scope. We can lend to um, a CPG type business that's got a product that's got revenues of those sizes, because the line of credit you would need in those types of businesses is still of the size that we can handle. But at some point, you're beyond our capacity.
so I guess what I'm trying to bring this is give me a case study or examples of operations with balance sheets and P&Ls that are successful. Like what does it look like right now, and take away the people that had old money inheritance, and take away the people who are being supplied by alternative sources of income.
Yeah. So um, there's a lot of dairy here. So we've done a couple of loans there. And I think there's a few characteristics of the operations that are making it work there on a smaller scale. So, first of all, it's roughly 100 head is the mark at which you can make a go of it at a small scale or not. But below that threshold, I think if you are selling the milk, by the hundredweight to one of the 5 or 6 larger buyers, that's the point at which you have to be. There are other operations that are smaller than that are selling raw milk direct to consumer, or are hooked into a home delivery type of business, or are making value added products, yogurts, cheeses, and stuff. That those folks can operate at a smaller scale and make it work, but they're getting a larger share of the consumer dollar. And So anyhow, there are certainly business models across that space that are working at that scale and producing enough income to transition land generationally, or acquire additional land, additional equipment, etc. This is on the smaller side, but we just financed an incredibly productive, I'm forgetting what the number is, but this couple that is operating on maybe 2 acres of land, and expecting to gross $100,000 and growing something like 75 different crops. So that sort of intensive model is quite a distinct type of operation, and that's full time for both of them. So I'm trying to think what else.
Well, when it comes when it comes to like livestock, how would you, I guess, set up? Right now, are you guys seeing more of an influx of requests for financing just buying cattle
Yeah,
because of the cost?
yeah, we were looking at one just yesterday. Uh, I think that although it creates some crazy moral hazard, I think that the USDA program on what's it called, the price guarantee program. You familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
I forget the name of it, but it essentially recognizes that cattle markets are at cyclical highs and provides insurance against price drops. So I say moral hazard in the sense that that can only do one thing, which is continue to, heat an overheated market. But from a lending perspective, it is one of the tools in the toolkit to mitigate the risks of, well, what is the value of this collateral in the event that, or rather, when the market swings the other way. But yeah, there is demand for that and a need for that. We were just going through the nuances of trying to help someone think through a term structure for their cow calf pairs that they were purchasing versus a line structure for the feeders that they were finishing. And that was particularly that operation. But
Yeah, so like on a cow calf operation, are you looking at like a 3-year payback period?
you mean as far as the loan structure?
Like when it comes due?
Uh, so you can do that a couple different ways. You could structure it like an equipment note where it's a 5 to 7 year term and you're paying monthly principal and interest, or you could have it be as a drawdown line of credit where you're paying interest only, and then there's a balloon at the end, which you're most likely just going to refinance into another facility. I personally, on cow calf, like the idea, like structuring that as a term note, um, because it is a long lived asset. And so
Yeah.
you're trying to match, as a general rule of thumb, we and most operators are trying to match the type of financing to the way that the underlying asset is being used. Um, and so that's a good example of that.
So it'd be more like a 5. You could have 5 to 7 years before the balloon.
There's no balloon if you're paying principal and interest along the way.
So what would the amortization be on that?
Uh, if there's no balloon, it's the same. The amortization is the same as the tenure of the loan. So you get a 5 to 7
Which
year term note, and you're
okay,
making
yeah,
monthly P&I the whole time.
yeah. So that's where you guys feel comfortable. So it's people buy cow calf because we actually just bought some cow calf pairs. We bought, and I was thinking like, how would that be structured if you were lending or if you wanted to scale it and say buy it, a lot more. Yeah, in my head, it would be 5 to 7 years too.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to structure that.
Yeah.
But there are other ways to do it too.
So when it comes to like feeders, you're looking at 18-month operating line interest only, or you'd like
Yep, that would be what's most typical.
and I think that's different because we've used an operating line before, and it was, I think the one we got through the FSA, it had to all be paid back in a year, which in a grass fed operation doesn't really work. Like you probably don't have your money back out of them yet.
Right. And most of those though or they, if they're not, they should be structured as continuously revolving. Like it's different from a business like an ice cream business that has a seasonal need where you're drawing it down to produce the product and then you pay it back in the summer months and then you draw it down again. Those would typically have a full pay down requirement. In the case of using a revolver for feeder, you we wouldn't typically have a full pay down requirement because as soon as you sell a load of animals, you buy the next load, right? So you're just cycling the line continuously as opposed to seasonally.
Got it.
But it depends on the type of operation and what you're doing.
How do you look at like pigs and chickens? Because obviously pigs and chickens don't, and probably I guess I'm not as familiar with like sheep and goat markets, but they don't have the backup plan like cattle do. Like you can take cattle and sell them and get cash out of them easier than some of these other livestocks. And if you scale up with pigs and chickens, your infrastructure cost is just as much probably as cattle. So how do you guys look at them from a risk standpoint?
Chickens are tricky, and we haven't done a chicken loan. I guess we've lent to operations that have a chicken component, but um, chicken are not a good source of collateral, just because
Yeah.
of the uh, timing, and because if something happens, it's pretty hard to unload them, so to speak. Um, Pigs are a little bit better just because you've got a little bit of a longer life cycle and a predictable return at auction. I think the tricky part there is, I guess this is also true of cattle in a grass-fed operation. It can be hard to value, for example, a feeder pig or a feeder steer that has gone past the point at which, from an age perspective, you would ordinarily put it into a feedlot in commodity markets. It can be hard to factor in, like, okay, what's the discount that animal is going to get in an auction. There are obviously regional differences as far as auction prices and local availability that affect those markets. Um, so I guess there are nuances to how those things need to be valued from a collateral perspective. But my point is, um, I don't see pigs as all that different from cows. It's just that um, when you uh, when you try to value them as part of a grass-fed or pasture-based type of operation, you have to factor in that they will be somewhat discounted if they're ultimately pushed into commodity markets. And I don't just mean discounted from like the premium that they would get in the program that they're in. I mean discounted because they're now they no longer sort of conform to commodity standards.
Hey, eco farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres U.S.A. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out, the Acres U.S.A. membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres U.S.A. magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres U.S.A., but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com or see details in the notes. Trying to think of how I want to ask this. I guess I'm interested in the idea of like, is there commodity, say a newer type of operation comes to you, is there a blueprint that can have success in like the commodity world? They have to finance land, maybe they're renting it, they have to get equipment and then turn a commodity crop around, even a diversified operation where they're growing multiple. Have you seen a successful operation that is not integrating livestock?
Um, I guess it depends on what you mean by commodity. Uh, and I think,
Annual crop production or haying.
but do you also mean like not certified organic, not uh,
No, like if the only way they make it is certified organic, like if that's your example, then that would be good. But like what is the solution for someone? If there's a kid right now that wants to get into agriculture and they're interested in growing corn, soybeans, and then some other diversified doing cover crops, and going that route, like what does it look like? How can they have success?
Yeah, I guess that's my answer. And we're a little bit far from, the corn and soybean rotation. Like by and large, that's not the type of operations we've worked with. Mostly because at a small scale, that's just a really hard way to make a go of it. Uh,
Yeah,
and so the reason I say that's my answer is what I mean is without um, a particular niche, whether that's organic or uh, heirloom varieties or your distribution method, uh, producing a purely commodity crop at a small scale is just a not very often viable way to make a living. So
yeah,
I guess my advice to young people contemplating that is like, where are the specific niches where you can produce a product that um, can obtain a premium through some means, and that means can either be the differentiated nature of the product itself or the differentiated way in which you're getting it to market,
yeah,
or a combination of those two things.
yeah. It's difficult because I'm sure there's lots of young people who would love to do something like that, and they look around and that's what a lot of people are doing, and I don't see the way to success unless you, like you talked about, like they've got to be really good at marketing their product, finding those niches.
It's not, and that was a big part of the basis of Walden Local. It's not a fair expectation that every farmer is going to be a brilliant marketer in this totally vertically integrated operation.
Yeah,
That's generally not an area of interest for most farmers and not a particular area of expertise. But what that tells me, and this is why we as a bank address the entirety of the value chain, is that change in agriculture is driven not by supply, but by demand. And so, how do we get a different agricultural system in this country that values something more than efficiency alone? Well, we have brands that articulate a value proposition for crops or raw materials that are produced in a particular way and both generate and react to consumer demand for those products. And then the supply chain will always be backfilled behind those brands. So as a farmer looking at that scenario, that's as much what I mean by a niche uh, as anything else is like you can attach yourself to a brand or brands that are producing a product that value something distinct about the way in which you're producing that product or the variety you're producing or what have you. And that's a place where you don't have to be the marketer. You just have to have hooked into something that um, values the way that you're producing the product.
yeah. So how do we push that forward? Like what are the things in your eyes when you look at this and you zoom way out? How do we get people in a position to be economically successful? Because our audience is the group. Like they're deciding to farm a little bit differently. They're thinking outside the box. but like where does the market need to come to, and what solutions need to be done to where, because pretty much have the same thought as you. Like I think it's unfair for people to think that every farmer is going to be able to make a website, sell direct to consumer. Plus there's scale here where it's just, if someone's big enough, like that doesn't make any sense anyways. Like what is the solution moving forward? Because I think we missed that a little bit in this industry, where people talk about all this cool stuff about soil health, and we love that for sure, but do we actually have the financial and economic models that support it, that someone can just farm and that's their livelihood?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and that's maybe a bigger question that I'm capable of answering in the context of this podcast. But a few thoughts. One is just that we may be at peak farmers market. I see a lot of folks trudging out to the farmers markets every weekend in relatively small towns and collecting what amounts to essentially not paying for their time. So if you set that aside and say, okay, I don't value my labor at all in sitting here and selling these products for 2 days, then this makes sense. And that's exactly as you're describing. Like that's not a fair expectation or a viable model. I forget what those numbers are, but the number of farmers markets that existed even 10 years ago is a fraction of what it is today. And so that just means, more vendors with smaller flow of people moving through them. So I don't think that is, and farmers markets are wonderful, and we should continue to shop at them, and I hope vendors continue to serve them. I just mean as a longer term, bigger solution. I'm not sure that's it, and I agree with you that not every farmer wants to spend their time that way or has a viable path there. But I think I think a potential path through, and again, this is why we lend across the entire value chain, from farmers to manufacturers to distributors to CPG brands to retail to wholesale. It really is all about the brands, because the brands are the ones that are earning the premium for the characteristics that they are selling. And so there's a organic regenerative brand of ice cream that out west called Alex that is creating an incredible incremental demand for A2 regenerative certified milk. That demand didn't exist before that brand came along. And so the farmers who have tapped into that are benefiting tremendously. Same thing for a good friend of mine started the brand Maple Hill Creamery, which is an organic grass-fed brand now, I think the best-selling milk in Whole Foods. There wasn't demand for grass-fed milk before that brand came along. And so if I were a farmer that was looking to grow my operation, earn a better premium for my labor and for my product, that's what I'd be looking for, is what are the emerging brands out there that value the same things I do, that are going to pay for the specific attributes that and production methods that you think are valuable.
Yeah. And we saw it, I'm not trying to be just negative. It's because we saw it in the organic world, because someone would come in, they'd get paid really well for their product, and then once that product became popular, maybe the distributor became corporatized or bought by somebody, and then all of a sudden, the prices come down, and usually it's the farmer that ends up taking the hit on that.
Almost always. But there's
Yeah.
something bigger going on there, where when we talk about attributes or product claims, there's a very predictable cycle that these things go through where a term is starts to be used by um, the crazy hippies, and I say that lovingly, that are on the leading edge of selling through farmers markets, and they use that term as a way of distinguishing their products from what's in the grocery store. And a long time ago, that was farm fresh or natural or um, those types of words. And then it was organic. Now it's regenerative. And each of those words goes through this fairly predictable cycle where it starts being used by the small folk. Then the large brands pick up the fact that there's a consumer set that values that term. And so they start using the term. And that's where we are today with regenerative. You've got like General Mills and other big
Yep.
companies slapping the label regenerative on products in the grocery store. And then at some point, regulators pick up on that and say, wow, this term is really proliferating and it means 100 different things. And so we need to get involved and clarify that term. And so then they do a public comment, and inevitably the large producers say, well, if you define that term in that narrow of a way, then we won't be able to produce it. And so you're leaving out a huge portion of the market. And so inevitably the term gets defined in a way that is favorable to industry. And at that point, the small folk have begun using the next term because the old term has been so watered down that it becomes meaningless. I think that's what has happened to organic, and I think inevitably that is what will happen with regenerative as well.
Yeah. No, that was a good synopsis of it. Next word we're pushing is ecological.
There you go.
That's been Acres' tagline
And the cycle
since
continues.
1971. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to catch the upswing of that.
I also,
Yeah, it's
as a sort of side note, I'm concerned with where regenerative is going because, and this is purely my own opinion, regenerative is a bit different than organic. Organic, I think we've come to a point where uh, agree or disagree, and I think there are significant problems with the way that it is currently defined for many categories within USDA, particularly for meat. Um, the standards are what they are, and they're sort of binary. Like that, I think, is fairly obvious. With regenerative, I don't think regenerative as a movement is meant to be like a yes or no thing. It's a spectrum, right? And it's a journey that many people are on, and you start with a couple of practices and then you add others. But to say that one farm is regenerative and another is not doesn't feel consistent with the original intentions of what that is supposed to mean. And so I think that's where we're going to end up is like, it looks like the current regenerative organic certification, which right now is a third party thing and maybe ultimately becomes integrated into the USDA organic program, maybe not. But at the end of the day, it's been structured as a binary, like it either is or it isn't. And I think that's sort of unfortunate because it suggests that you either haven't done anything or you're done, and that's not really consistent with the spirit of a regenerative operation, which looks a lot more like nature and therefore is cyclical and you're never done.
Yeah. I think the only thing that can really save it is technology, and if we get tools that can actually test the food, kind of like what Dan Kittredge is creating with Bionutrient Food Association, where if a consumer has a tool on their phone or an app on their phone, they take a picture of a piece of broccoli and they can get a feedback of the nutrient density or if it has a chemical in it or something. I think that's probably one way that can be, we can be more transparent with the consumer, but that could easily be captured by someone as well.
Totally. Audacious are you familiar with them?
No.
Audacious is another company going down that same route around, how can you use technology to prove the provenance and or depth of the nutritional content of any product under the sun. And I think there's a huge need for that, because that's where you really make the distinction between like what's actually real and what's not.
Yeah. And I'm not like a huge fan of nonprofits, generally speaking, but Dan's is a nonprofit, and I think that tool might need to be in the hands of a nonprofit because it is just so powerful. And if it was profit driven, we might have an issue. But yeah, if you think about it from a beef perspective, like that's going to solve the grass-fed versus grain-fed conversation. Someone's going to be able to take a picture of meat and get the omega-3 and omega-6 levels and know that that animal wasn't in a feedlot.
Yep. I think there's some truth to that. Although even within that, there's some nuances. Like if you're feeding animals grass pellets in a feedlot environment,
Well, I think, yeah. I think there's some data that supports, or there'll be some changes in the way that meat is based on that, but I'm not 100% sure. But that's it's the thing is, like, that technology is important, and they're going to package it in a way that it's stupid simple for the consumer. They're going to take a picture and just be like yes or no.
Yeah.
So like you will still have those little things that the company that's trying to make money on this app or that technology isn't going to care to distinguish the difference between a feedlot grass-fed animal versus one that's actually on pasture, even though there's probably some things they can test for in there.
Yeah.
All right, Charlie, this was a great conversation. Is there anything else you want to, where should people go look for Walden Mutual? Anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up?
I guess I'll just leave you with two thoughts. One is, if you're looking for a more impactful place to put your deposit dollars, come open an account. You can do it right on our website, waldenmutual.com. And if you want to talk about lending, whether you're a farm or other type of food business, or any type of business that has a lens towards sustainability, I'm always up to have those conversations. You can email me directly, just Charley, Charley at waldenmutual.com.
Sounds good, Charlie. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck with everything you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Taylor.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.